Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, brothers and sisters, friends and enemies, welcome to We Act Radio. This is Kimon Freeman, joined by the illustrious Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the chair of the History of African American Studies at the University of Houston. He was a candidate for the United States Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has written several books on a variety of subjects, mostly centered around struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. The late Manning Marble has said Gerald Horne is one of the most gifted and insightful historians on racial matters of his generation. And he also just celebrated a birthday on January 3rd. So happy belated birthday, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for all the work you have done and continue to do. You are obviously an authority on social and cultural analysis of race and class, so much so that your book on white supremacy, we hosted a pop-up library and a distinguished venue called the hotel on K Street is missing me. I'm having a senior moment. And your book was stolen. Just, that's the Eaton Hotel, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, on 14th and K Street. Your book was missing. All right, so that's how in demand your analysis and your work is. But here we are at Trump 2.0. We have seen, the political magazine said Trump 1.0 it garnered the resistance, but Trump 2.0 seems to be more of an acquiescence. Your thoughts on that and unpack this as we go from here.
Well, certainly we should take the fact that Mr. Trump got 75 to 80 million votes very seriously. We should not see that as some sort of historical accident. And I address my remarks pointedly to the population of African descent and certainly the progressive community, because my work has shown, my historical investigations have shown that the way we have been able to overcome domestic barriers and domestic hurdles, the likes of which we are now witnessing, is through lengthening the battlefield, by internationalizing the question, by seeking allies overseas, by seeking allies abroad. And what's striking about the present moment is that Mr. Trump has opened the door for us to do so, certainly inadvertently. What I mean is, by his threats on neighboring Canada, he has caused the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, 91 years old, to write a piece suggesting that Canada needs to internationalize the struggle to overcome being swallowed by the United States of America, which, by the way, has been a long-term goal of the United States of America, stretching back 2 centuries to the War of 1812. And so Jean Chrétien suggested that Canada seek urgent consultations with Denmark, because Mr. Trump has threatened Denmark and its colony Greenland, seek urgent consultations with Panama, because Mr. Trump has threatened to seize the Panama Canal. And what's remarkable about the present moment in the United States of America is that I don't see that same kind of thinking. I see a lot of hand wringing. I see a lot of gnashing of teeth and heart palpitations, but I don't necessarily see the obvious, which is that those concerned, as they well should be, about the rise of Trumpism and neo-fascism should be urgently seeking global consultations, the likes of which the former Prime Minister of Canada, no radical he, has just suggested for his sprawling homeland.
Well, we clearly are seeing the American empire in decline. You want to call this late stage capitalism. If you want to say, it's also the birthday of Martin Luther King, and his next to last speech was delivered right here in Washington, D.C., March 31st, 1968. He said that far too often people live in periods of great social change, but yet they fail to develop the new ideas, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. And that speech was entitled Remaining Awake During a Great Revolution. And with the world, I think it's 70% under authoritarian rule. Are we truly in the throes, in the midst of that revolution? Is this indeed late stage capitalism? Is the American empire finally in decline?
Oh, certainly. As a matter of fact, I don't think you can understand the desperate gambits of Mr. Trump and his cabal in threatening Canada, Denmark, Panama, without understanding that this is a cry of weakness. What has happened in recent decades is that you've seen the rise of China, you've seen the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You might have seen today's headlines wherein it's suggested that China is enjoying a trade surplus of $1 trillion. The United States is enduring a trade deficit of about the same amount. Now, to be sure, the trade deficit that the United States is enduring is not wholly from China. It has trade deficits with the European Union as well. But I think that what's happening is that U.S. imperialism, which inadvertently helped to build up China, going back not only to the era of Richard M. Nixon in the early 1970s and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, but also to the administration of Jimmy Carter, the sainted Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. And so, as Nixon suggested right before he passed away, the United States inadvertently may have created, from the point of view of imperialism, a quote, Frankenstein monster, unquote. That is to say, that its zeal to build up China in order to destabilize the former Soviet Union, the United States has created this juggernaut, or has helped to create this juggernaut, I should say. And this is the major goal of Senator Marco Rubio, the incoming Secretary of State, that is to say, to somehow bring China to heel. But I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. In fact, if you look over the horizon and you begin to try to espy what your grandchildren and great grandchildren will live through, assuming that climate change or nuclear war does not overcome this small planet, you can begin to glimpse the outlines of what's happening. That is to say, that the United States and its European allies are going to try to destabilize China. China, in turn, is going to find it necessary to build up allies in what's called the global South, Africa, Brazil, etc. Mr. Trump is threatening his allies, so-called, speaking of Canada, that is to say, unless they spend more money on the U.S. military-industrial complex, then he will be slapping tariffs on them. And that includes, of course, the European Union and Britain as well. And that will help to break up the North Atlantic bloc, which has been so powerful over the last half millennium. At the same time that the BRICS and China are consolidating power in the global South. And you see this right now in the Sahel region, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where, according to a Black YouTuber, I'm afraid I can't recall his name, these military-led regimes are engaged in what he calls gunpoint diplomacy. That is to say that these nations are blessed and endowed with gold and uranium, etc. Historically, the North Atlantic powers have exploited these resources. But what's been happening of late is that they have been clawing back millions, if not billions of dollars. In fact, a major uranium producer in France, which supplies uranium to the nuclear plants that supplies France with electricity, the uranium was mostly coming from Niger. But after Niger began to claw back millions from them, they went bankrupt. In Mali, you saw that a number of mining executives, particularly from Canada and Australia, were arrested, and they were not turned back over to their homelands until they had coughed up a major fortune. And so, unless these regimes get caught up in fighting and squabbling over who's going to be enjoying these millions, if not billions, you can easily foresee a future wherein these African nations are in the vanguard of spending heavily on education, healthcare, etc., from selling their natural resources, their gold, their uranium, etc. At the same time, the North Atlantic bloc are at each other's throats. And that could spell the certain demise of the hegemony of the North Atlantic bloc and the continued rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. In other words, we're in a brave new world. But as one who surveys media on a regular basis, particularly Black media, I'm not sure if the recognition of this reality has dawned. And in fact, I put forth this idea, which is an update of the idea put forward by W.E.B. Du Bois some decades ago, where he talked about double consciousness, you recall, this idea of being both African and being a U.S. national. I think that in the 21st century, what we're going to have to confront is not necessarily double consciousness, but the prospect of double allegiances. That is to
Uh,
say, as the United States hurtles towards incipient decline, and most of us carry these blue passports signaling that we are U.S. nationals, at the same time that Africa is at odds with the United States. And it's not clear to me who Black people are going to have allegiance to. Will it be to the nation whose passport they carry, or will it be to their ancestral homeland? The fact that I cannot answer that question definitively as of January 15, 2025, speaks volumes.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think that should be the title of this program. So thank you for blessing us with that insight, because unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., we have seen where the federal government is the major employer of Black people in this city, and because of that, they are more than hesitant to be critical of the policies of this government. They are hesitant to be critical on any actual government policy because they feel as if it's biting the hand that feeds them, and so they have a false allegiance to them. But that is purely because of their financial interests. In the throes of a declining empire, and those financial interests also decline, I would assume that separation of the allegiance would be easier, because Nelson Mandela, Madiba, as I say, said that the enemies of the West are not ours. And I hope that we're going to be able to make that distinction. So if we can decrease our level of dependency on the system and increase our interdependency on each other, is what I would like to see. I see people going patriating to Ghana and other countries in Africa, getting dual citizenship. So it looks as if we may be pointing to that direction. But we have a major event this Monday on MLK Day, anti-inauguration ball, if you will. And the venue has been getting calls because people who want to attend don't want to pay with credit cards. They don't want their name on a financial document saying they supported an anti-inauguration. They want to know if they can pay cash at the door. This is what the venue is dealing with. So we are indeed in the midst of a different time. Can you help me unpack that on where do we go from here, chaos or community, and how do we can decrease our level of dependency on a system that we find ourselves at odds with and has clearly been diametrically opposed to our existence since we got here?
Well, there was a step forward just a few weeks ago to veer towards the positive tip. What I mean is, a few weeks ago in Havana, Cuba, there was an international meeting of peoples of African descent. And I'm happy to say that there was a substantial delegation from the United States of America, which is something of a breakthrough. Just the other day, in fact, just yesterday, Mr. Biden removed Cuba from the so-called terrorism list, where it never should have been placed in the first instance. Now, we all know that incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio will probably seek to reverse that decision. But having said that, I draw a connection between our folks going to Havana and engaging in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and Mr. Biden, whose Democratic Party is heavily dependent upon the Black vote, making the decision he should have made years ago to remove Cuba from the terrorism list. Now, I'm not sure if I can say definitively and authoritatively that we're out of the woods, that we recognize the necessity for internationalism, but you mentioned the continued flow of Black Americans to Ghana, for example. Not only to Ghana, but there's a large Black American expatriate community in South Africa, a large one in Tanzania, stretching back decades, including the former leader of the Kansas City Black Panther Party, Pete O'Neill, who, by the way, wrote a very interesting memoir that I recommend. You have Black American expatriate communities in Ethiopia, in Mauritius, which is an island archipelago off the southeastern
I
coast
would
of.
like to get to Burkina Faso, but I
Say,
digress.
say that again.
I would like to get to Burkina Faso. Am I saying that correctly? I digress.
Oh yeah, Burkina Faso, of course. There are the Thomas Sankara Center in Ouagadougou. You have Black Americans there as well. That's a positive sign. But what I would like to see more is more organization. We suffered a withering blow when Trans-Africa, which had headquarters in Washington, D.C., formerly under the leadership of the late Randall Robinson, passed into history because it was the mission of Trans-Africa, as its name suggests, to lobby uh, Washington on behalf of Africa and the Caribbean and to weld Black Americans into a mighty force to that end. We need an updated version of Trans-Africa. We need not only an updated version of Trans-Africa, we need our existing organizations, particularly the NAACP, if I may, to pay more attention to what's going on beyond these shores. Because once again, as a person who monitors quite a number of these Black YouTube programs, which are sprouting up in profusion, it's remarkable to me how few of them actually deal with what's going on outside the United States of America. And then when they're dealing with the United States of America, needless to say, it's gloom and doom. I mean, because it's a very unfortunate circumstance we face here. But somehow they don't make that next connection, which is that to reverse that gloom and doom, we need more internationalism. That has been our saving grace over the centuries. That was how we were able to rescue ourselves from enslavement, going back to our solidarity with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. That's the way in the 20th century we were able to rescue ourselves from Jim Crow. And that is the way we'll be able to rescue ourselves from post Jim Crow.
We're here on the birthday of Martin Luther King, and we know that the speech that got him killed was Beyond Vietnam, delivered April 4th, 1967. Of course, he was taken off the stage April 4th, 1968, to indicate that that was the line. Um, Malcolm X, we're preparing to celebrate the 100th anniversary of his birth. He was threatening to take America before the United Nations, or the World Court, if you will. And America has always been hesitant to acknowledge any international court. So how is it that we can actually live by the words of Nelson Mandela when he says the enemies of the West are not ours? How do we promote that narrative when we've seen that that is the line? And perhaps that is the fear that they have over so many of our people, as you say, in our media. Or is it by design that they've been told that this is the line and they are following suit? Your thoughts?
Well, number one, it reminds me of a force field that you can set up in your backyard, whereby if your canine, if your dog veers beyond a certain point, they receive a shock and they immediately retreat. And I think that perhaps unwittingly, our community has ingested the lesson that if we veer beyond the four corners of the United States of America, we'll receive a shock, and nobody wants to receive a shock. And what's even more remarkable is that in Black America, understandably, we have a culture of resistance. That's the way we are able to overcome uh, slavery and Jim Crow. And as they once said in the streets, there's a tendency in our community to sell wolf tickets. That is to say, to try to threaten aggressors that we will strike back mightily.
Mhm.
But I think that our oppressors have come to recognize that that's what we're doing. We're selling wolf tickets because we don't really necessarily back it up with any sort of militant action. I mean, for example, uh, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which has moved to indict Benjamin Netanyahu, the perpetrator of genocide in Gaza. Right there in your city, within a stone's throw of where you're sitting, the US Congress has voted to impose sanctions against the ICC
Mm.
because of their temerity in seeking to indict Mr. Netanyahu. You mentioned Martin Luther King and his Beyond Vietnam speech. And of course, as you correctly note, his veering into the international arena was seen as a dire threat by the oppressors, not least in Washington, D.C. Also seen as a dire threat was his speech in February 1968, a few weeks before he was slain, where at the behest of Jack Odell, formerly of Washington, D.C., a former chairperson of the board of Pacifica Radio, by the way, a man who, once again, a stone's throw from where you're sitting, President Kennedy took Dr. King into the Rose Garden and instructed him to distance himself from Jack Odell because of Jack's radical connections and radical ties.
Wow.
Dr. King said that he would, but he did not, which then led the FBI pugnacious bulldog-like leader, J. Edgar Hoover, to call Dr. King one of the most notorious liars in the United States of America. In any event, in February 1968, Dr. King gave a speech in New York City on behalf of Freedom Ways magazine, where Jack served as an editor. At that speech, Dr. King saluted W.E.B. Du Bois, who had died 5 years earlier, and said that we should not castigate W.E.B. Du Bois for joining the Communist Party, which he did in 1961, a few years before he died in 1963, on the onset of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And voila, a few months later, a few weeks later, Dr. King was shot down in Memphis, Tennessee, because he was clearly moving further to the left. He was moving aggressively against war making. He was poised to bring a small army of poor people to Washington, D.C., and pledging not to leave until certain demands were met.
Right.
And so he had become a threat to the system. And so he had to go. And that's been the sad tale of many of our movements and leaders. That is to say, we have not been able to protect them. We have not been able to devise systems whereby we could fight back aggressively, which is one of the reasons why, as of today, we're staring down the barrel of neo-fascism, why you have folks who are leery and wary about using their credit cards to go to your anti-inaugural ball, precisely because we're on the defensive. But we do not have to be on the defensive because we have a global majority behind us if we just turn and look over our left shoulder and glimpse them.
I like that. The left shoulder. I got you. To the left, as another famous Estonian. Is that, why do we say that when you're from Houston?
Houstonian.
Estonian. That's Beyonce to the left. We need to, and thank you for sharing your insight and this valuable blueprint with us. How can we penetrate pop culture, in your opinion, with some of these messages? Because it seems that, as they said before, a weapon has been formed against us. Our own music. That you said, our resistance is what got us here. And so, but there hasn't been a lot of resistance in our music anymore. A lot of it has been muted. We still have some things that break through, but by and large, like we're looking at, we was talking about destabilizing China. We're about to see TikTok being removed from American access. And that was a great phenomenon in pop culture here. But how can we penetrate pop culture, or what do you think we need to be doing to move us forward? And I think perhaps the withdrawal of TikTok would be one of the things that gets the attention of a lot of people who is making a living in pop culture on that platform. Your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned TikTok, which to this moment is controlled by Chinese interests. The U.S. Supreme Court will be ruling rather shortly as to whether or not that will continue. Now, what's curious about that is that today's press reports that Elon Musk, the man with roots in apartheid South Africa, purportedly the richest man on planet Earth, first buddy of Donald J. Trump, is slated to purchase TikTok to combine with his interest in Twitter/X.
Is that right?
Correct. That is reported in today's press. Now, what's interesting about that is 2 points. Number one, in terms of the contradictions of the system, and since we don't think strategically it's difficult for us to take advantage of obvious contradictions, Elon Musk, of course, is heavily invested in China, which U.S. imperialism is sworn to destabilize. Tesla, as Steve Bannon, one of your fellow Washingtonians and a comrade of Mr. Trump, has suggested, Tesla is up to his eyeballs in business dealings with China. And you notice that Elon Musk doesn't have a mumbling word to say in opposition to China, even though that's the theme of the incoming Trump administration. Now, it's even more curious that what I've just reported to you is not on the radar in terms of trying to play on these contradictions between and amongst the right wing, between Bannon and Musk. Bannon has said that before Inauguration Day, which is Monday, he's going to be chasing Elon Musk out of the Trump inner circle. I don't think that's going to happen, at least not by Monday. Maybe it'll happen after Monday. But obviously, we need to put our heads together and ascertain how we can play upon these contradictions, which a lot of it has to do with immigration. Of course, as noted, Elon Musk himself is an immigrant, as are many of the incoming leaders of the Trump administration, many of them, like Elon Musk, having roots in apartheid South Africa. Another factoid that somehow has escaped the attention of many in our movement. I guess they don't read. I don't know what the deal is.
Well, that may be,
But
may
in any
well be.
case, um, how do we play on these contradictions? I mean, for example, Elon Musk has said that he wants to see a continuation of these HB1 visas that allows companies like Tesla and his other enterprises to exploit the South Asian engineering labor. The United States, being the inheritor of the British Empire, thinks it has a right and a duty to exploit South Asian labor like London did for so many centuries. Interestingly enough, the leaders of both Microsoft and Alphabet, which control Google, are led by men of South Asian descent, Indian descent, interestingly enough. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, another South Asian billionaire, say they want to continue these HB1 visas. The base, the working class and middle class base of the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again movement, says hell no.
Mhm.
But thus far, they have been thwarted. The question is, how do you play on those contradictions to get them fighting each other so they won't have time to be fighting us, for example?
Yeah.
Somehow that has escaped the attention of many of our movements, leaders, organizations. And you mentioned music. I mean, of course, it's a formidable hurdle, an obstacle to overcome, because under capitalism, music, like any other interest, is controlled by monopoly capital, for example. And they have these guardrails that prevent positive and progressive messages from trickling through, forcing our creators or our artists to oftentimes make compromises in order to become well known, in order to become celebrated, in order to get their music into the marketplace. And it's going to be difficult to overcome that hurdle. But of course, one way to do it is to try to work with our friends abroad. I mean, for example, Spotify, which has a significant footprint with regard to music. It's not a US based corporation. If I'm not mistaken, it's based in Northern Europe, where we have a lot of potential friends and allies. I mean, for example, in my latest book, Armed Struggle, I talk about how the Black Panthers and Vietnam War dissenters and deserters found refuge in Stockholm, Sweden, for example. Their descendants still reside there. But once again, if we're not thinking globally, if we're not thinking creatively, we'll just be resigned to wringing our hands and singing the blues without even those blues trickling into the marketplace.
You know, my business partner is Alex Lawson. He's the executive director of Social Security Works, who's also a sponsor for the anti-inauguration ball at the Black Cat on MLK Day, by the way. But he says that he's expecting Elon Musk and Trump to have a confrontation, that that love affair is not going to last the entire administration, and he's going to be rooting for that war between the two. I thought that the H-1 visas that you mentioned, because of the backlash, the white backlash, was going to be the beginning of it. But like you said, obviously that has not been the case, and it has not been enough. So how do we play on these the hypocrisies that we see. For example, we have this whole thrust by mostly from the GOP, but I think it's bipartisan, that they're trying to give conditions on any money to battle California wildfires. They want to put conditions on the money to go to California, but they don't want to put any conditions on military aid to apartheid Israel. So conditions on an actual state of the union, and no conditions on a foreign country. These contradictions definitely need to be raised. The insurance companies that tens of thousands of people insurance policies were canceled before the fires. We've seen the Free Luigi movement, with a gentleman who assassinated health insurance executive, and the huge backlash on that and the support for him. We are beginning to see those hypocrisies being highlighted, and we need to see more of it. Again, Martin Luther King, he said that the whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must get our own house in order. What are these hypocrisies that some people, as you say, who are not reading, are missing?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the LA fires, because that raises another weak point in the armor of our antagonists. That is to say, that a consensus has developed amongst climatologists that these fires, if not caused by global heating, were certainly worsened and exacerbated by global heating. That is to say, burning of fossil fuels overheats the planet. And if you have a drought-ridden atmosphere, as you have in Southern California, it makes it more likely that, with Santa Ana winds blowing in from Nevada and Utah acting as a bellows, that any spark can be turned into a roaring fire, which has been going on for a week now. It's quite incredible. It's going to have tremendous knock-on effects. You've seen the historic Black community of Altadena burned to a crisp. You see in one of the most difficult housing markets in this country, that is to say, with homelessness stalking the Southland, you have thousands of people flooding into that market, driving up rental prices. But what's interesting is that the Financial Times of London had a piece the other day pointing out the contradiction between the European Union and the US, the Trump administration, on the question of global heating. That is to say, that the European Union has strictures with regard to investment, seeking to curb investment in fossil fuels, in oil companies like ExxonMobil, for example.
Yeah, they are fairly subsidized, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, brothers and sisters. Please continue.
Of course, not only that, but the state of Texas has suggested that if investment firms try to put restrictions on investments in fossil fuel, that they'll be sanctioned. So you have this standoff, this confrontation between the European Union on the one hand, which wants strictures against fossil fuels, and the Trump team and the right wing saying, hell no. So how do we inject ourselves into that fray? Well, the way we inject ourselves, of course, we need delegations to Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union, where we add our strength to theirs and help to try to save the planet. Recall what I said a few moments ago about your great-grandchildren, whether or not they will be able to, in fact, exist, not only because of the prospect of nuclear war, but because of the prospect of climate change and global heating. This is a real possibility. I mean, these LA fires are continuing to this very moment. We may not have seen the worst of these LA fires, by the way. And LA is just a signal for what is to come nationally as the climate and the atmosphere changes. We need new thinking. I don't see that new thinking arising for whatever reason. But if people sincerely care about their community, sincerely care about their families, later for the community, then they'll throw themselves into this struggle head first.
Throw themselves in a struggle head first, scared. And you are truly on the money with this, because Miami is going to be on the water in 2 decades. That we're and you're not going to be able to get any flood insurance in Miami. Just like they have been canceling fire insurance policies in LA. This is where we're heading, and this late stage capitalism has to doesn't have to, we don't have to sink with the ship. So how do we begin to separate ourselves so that we don't go down with the ship? That is what we're wrestling with. And I am proud to say that a lot of people are beginning to separate their plight with America's plight. And we're seeing perhaps a pushback of resistance along those lines. But I think we're falling short on actual critical mass. Some people say 3.5% of the population constitutes critical mass, and that's the breaking point for anything to happen. If that's the case, do you think Trump 2.0 is going to get us there faster?
I don't know. I wish I could say yes, but you mentioned a moment or two ago something that many of us were already familiar with, which is that the federal government is a major employer in Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
And if not the federal government, the city of Washington, if not the federal government and city of Washington across the border, the state governments in Maryland and Virginia. And many of these employees are union members. How many of these union members are active in their unions? Because ultimately, unions can be our secret weapon, but it won't happen by itself. People have to be active in these unions. These unions, they have huge treasuries, for example. In fact, you mentioned Dr. King, as did myself. One of the reasons that Dr. King and his comrades were able to fly from city to city and organize was because they were receiving funding from unions, like the United Auto Workers, for example. And speaking of United Auto Workers and connecting this to our earlier discussion about China, you have credible analysts who are suggesting that GM and Ford, the pillars of the automobile industry, may not exist in a decade because of competition from Chinese interests like BYD, for example, and NIO, and electric vehicles, for example. If GM and Ford go down, what's going to happen to the United Auto Workers, which right now contains a significant percentage of Black members? Now, I'm not sure to the extent to which the progressive and Black membership of the UAW is following into their industry. I hope they are, because as I said, they may be out on the streets within a decade or so. Uh, Folks are not connecting the dots. And I'm afraid to say, as I look historically, I can say that this is not unusual, that folks oftentimes assume that what's obtaining today will obtain tomorrow. And I
Mm.
guess that's comforting. I guess that allows you to walk through this life happily without a care in the world. But history is a stern instructor. And history tells us that what obtains today does not necessarily obtain tomorrow. And that if you want to ensure a progressive and a positive outcome, you have to be involved. You have to be active. You have to organize. You have to organize alongside like minded individuals. And that is ultimately the lesson of history.
That's ultimately the lesson of history. You heard it here first, boys and girls. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of unionization. Union membership peaked in the 1950s with over 30% of the private sector workforce being represented in unions. That is down to 6% today. So the system has connected the dots, and they are very clear on what they need to do to move forward their agenda. It's time for the people to connect the dots and move forward with our own agenda. Dr. Horne, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to give you a moment to make any closing comments to wrap this up as we move forward. Hopefully, with a more focused manner for rising to the occasion, if you will, preparing to participate, as Martin Luther King would say. What are your thoughts as we prepare to wrap up and move forward boldly into this unknown?
Well, I would be engaged in false modesty if I failed to mention a couple of my latest books. One, African Americans and a New History of the United States of America, just out a few days ago. The other, Armed Struggle, question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, out about 6 months ago. It tells the story, speaking of this latter work, of an instance from the recent past where brothers and sisters felt that they could take no more, and they decided to launch armed struggle to try to overthrow the status quo. But alas, they did not necessarily engage in the kind of analysis of the forces on the ground, nor did they take into account the international situation in a way that could have propelled their struggle more effectively. And as a result, you have many people, best case scenario, winding up in exile, like the aforementioned Pete O'Neill in today's Tanzania, or not to mention some still in prison and others, of course, 6 feet under. So there are lessons to be learned from that earlier episode, and lessons that will hold us in good stead for the future. But if there is one theme that comes out of a good deal of my work and comes out of my remarks this morning, is the dire necessity for internationalism. The dire necessity for internationalism. We have to reach across the waters, reach across the borders. We have to seek out our friends and allies in Canada, in Cuba, in Southern Africa, in China, elsewhere, if we are to survive the Trumpocalypse.
There you have it. And again, I'm going to have to replace the book that was stolen off the shelves at Eaton Hotel here in Washington, D.C., White Supremacy Confronting the U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. When I get that book replaced, we're going to have to make arrangements to get it autographed again. Let me leave you with some good thoughts, good juju here. This is from the director of the Run for the Jewels video, Ooh La La, where they're in the video, money is no longer worth anything. It's trash. It's in the street like discarded litter. And she goes on to say, imagine a world on the day that the age-old struggle of class was finally over, a day that humanity, empathy, and community were victorious over the forces that would separate us based on arbitrary systems created by man. A fantasy of waking up on a day that there is no monetary system, no dividing line, no false construct to tell our fellow man that they are less or more than anyone else. Not that people are without, but that the whole meaning of money has vanished. That we have somehow solved our self-created caste system and can now start fresh with love, hope, and celebration. It is a dream of humanity's V-Day, and the party we know will pop off. That's Vanessa Belatek, the director of Ooh La La by Run Jews. I hope to see you at that party, Dr. Horne. And thank you for the work you're doing, and keep the faith and keep writing those books, because those blueprints will be read by those who plan on being here.
Right on.
Thank you, sir. Continued success. Happy New Year and happy belated birthday.